Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really going to get into the foundational ideas that shape psychology.
Yeah, think of it as a guide, especially for you psychology students listening, to the big schools of thought.
Hmm.
How we try to figure out why people do what they do.
Exactly. We want to give you a really clear, engaging overview of these core perspectives you'll definitely be bumping into in your studies.
hmm We've looked at materials covering basically four main approaches. There's the psychodynamic,
Right.
the cognitive, the biological, and the learning approach. And with learning, we'll look at both conditioning and social learning theory.
Okay, got it. So our mission today is pretty clear. Really dig into each one, understand the core ideas, the strengths, what they offer.
And the weaknesses, too,
Yeah.
where they might fall short.
Right. So by the end, hopefully you'll have a solid framework for everything else you learn in psychology. So where do we kick things off?
Let's start at, well, pretty much the beginning with one of the earliest big ideas,
Hmm.
the psychodynamic approach.
Okay, psychodynamic. That's Freud mostly, isn't it? What was so important about it?
Absolutely. Freud's the big name. What was really groundbreaking was that it was kind of the first major theory to say, hey, mental health issues might actually stem from psychological causes.
Not just physical problems or, other explanations people had back then.
Exactly. Not physical illness, not like supernatural forces. This was a massive shift in thinking about the mind itself.
Wow. Okay. So what were some of the sort of key strengths of looking at it this way?
Well, like we said, it was the first truly psychological theory for mental health stuff.
Mm.
Freud suggested things like depression could be maybe anger turned inward.
Ah, I heard that one.
Yeah, or maybe having a really harsh inner critic, what he called the superego.
Hmm.
Move the whole conversation.
Right. Away from just looking at the body or spirits. What else was strong about it?
Another really interesting point was the biological links. Freud actually connected our basic biological drives, things like hunger, sex drive, to our mental well-being.
How so?
The idea was, if these fundamental needs aren't met, or they get frustrated somehow, that could actually lead to psychological problems, maybe even mental illness.
So, a link between basic needs and mental health. Did that lead to any practical help?
It really did. This thinking led straight to developing useful therapies. Psychoanalysis, the talking cure.
Right, talking about your past.
Exactly. Talking through past experiences to uncover unconscious conflicts driving current problems. And while therapy looks different now, that core idea, it's influenced so many modern therapies for things like anxiety and depression. For you as students, seeing that historical thread is important.
Yeah, you can see the legacy. And wasn't childhood a huge deal in this approach?
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm?
A massive strength was its focus on childhood. Freud really hammered home how much early experiences shape us as adults, our personality, our mental health, and that focus. Still incredibly important in psychology today.
Okay, so definitely some pioneering ideas. But like any theory, it must have faced some pushback, some criticisms.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
A big one is that it's often seen as too subjective.
Meaning?
Well, Freud's interpretations of dreams, memories, even slips of the tongue,
Yeah.
they were very much his interpretations, potentially biased.
Right. So hard to know if someone else would see it the same way. Makes it unreliable.
Kind of, yeah. Which leads to another major critique. It's not really falsifiable.
Falsifiable, meaning you can't prove it wrong.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Good science usually relies on theories you can test and potentially disprove with evidence. But lots of psychodynamic ideas, especially about the unconscious mind, well, you can't directly see or measure the unconscious.
I see. So it's hard to test scientifically. That's a big one for you students to remember the importance of testability.
Crucial. And then there are more practical issues too, therapy issues.
Like what?
Traditional psychoanalysis, it takes a long time, years often, and it's expensive.
Ah, so not very accessible for a lot of people.
Exactly, which is a real limitation.
And I guess spending all that time on the past, could that be a downside too?
That's another criticism, yeah, that I might be too focused on the past. Sometimes digging endlessly into childhood might, distract from dealing with the problem someone's facing right now.
Right, you need to address the present situation too. Anything else? I think I recall something about cause and effect.
Yes, good point. The early psychodynamic stuff struggled to establish clear cause and effect. Because it wasn't based on controlled experiments, it's hard to scientifically prove that a specific unconscious conflict causes a specific behavior.
Unlike some later approaches.
Right. Later approaches like cognitive and behavioral really emphasize using methods that could draw stronger conclusions about cause and effect, something you'll see evolve as you study psychology's history.
Okay, so a really influential start, changed the game, but definitely had issues with scientific rigor and practicality. Where to next then?
Let's jump to an approach that, well, partly grew out of wanting more scientific footing, the cognitive approach.
Cognitive. Thinking, memory, attention,
Mhm.
all that internal mental stuff.
Exactly. The cognitive approach zooms right in on our mental processes, how we think, perceive, remember, pay attention, the mechanics inside our head.
So what are the strengths of focusing so tightly on those internal workings?
A key strength is that focus on specific mental processes. Instead of, really broad concepts, it looks at the details. Like,
Okay.
how does memory actually work?
Right.
You get models like the multi-store model of memory, something you students will likely study. It tries to map out the stages. This specificity makes it much easier to research empirically.
Breaking it down into testable parts. And didn't this lead to some really practical therapies?
Oh, absolutely. Understanding thought processes was huge for developing cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
Which is everywhere now.
It really is. CBT is super effective and focuses directly on changing those unhelpful thinking patterns to improve how we feel and behave. If you're interested in clinical work, you'll see CBT constantly.
Definitely a major tool. But are there limitations to the cognitive approach?
Yes, a common one is about low ecological validity.
Ecological validity, meaning it's too lab-based.
Sort of. Because studies are often done in controlled labs, the situations can feel artificial. So the question is, do the results truly apply to messy, real-life situations?
Like, remembering word lists in a lab isn't quite the same as remembering your grocery list when you're stressed at the store.
Exactly that kind of thing. Another point is that it doesn't always consider individual differences enough.
How so?
It often aims for general principles of how everyone's mind works, which is valuable, but it might sometimes gloss over the unique ways different people process information or see the world. That's something for you future researchers to think about how to capture that variability.
Good point. We're not all wired the same way. Okay, so we've done the mind. Let's switch gears to the body, the biological approach.
Right. The biological approach takes a very different angle. It emphasizes biology, our brain, genes, hormones, nervous system, as the key driver of behavior and mental processes.
And the strengths of looking at us through that biological lens.
Well, a big one is it uses scientific methods, rigorous experiments, brain scans like fMRI, genetic studies.
So lots of hard data.
Exactly. It produces reliable, quantifiable data. That commitment to empirical evidence is really central here.
And has this led to concrete results like treatments?
Definitely. Understanding the biology behind mental health has led to effective medical treatments. Think about antidepressants, for example.
Right, targeting neurotransmitters like serotonin for depression.
Precisely. That link between a biological mechanism and a treatment is a major contribution. Again, something very relevant for your studies.
Makes sense. So identifying a biological issue and treating it directly. What about the downsides?
Well, a major criticism is that it can sometimes ignore environmental influences.
How so?
By focusing so much on biology, it might overlook how important things like family, culture, life experiences are in shaping who we are and how we behave. It's that whole nature versus nurture debate, isn't it? Or rather, nature and nurture.
Yeah, focusing on the hardware but maybe missing the software. Our experiences.
That's a good way to put it. Another tricky area is that it raises ethical questions.
Ethical questions.
About what? About things like biological determinism. If our biology dictates our behavior, what does that mean for free will? For personal responsibility? Especially in areas like, say, criminal justice.
Oh, deep questions. If it's in your genes, are you still responsible? Yep. Trick stuff.
Very tricky. Important philosophical ground to cover as you get deeper into psychology.
Okay, so we've covered the mind, the biology. Now let's look outward at how we learn from the world. The learning approach, starting with conditioning.
Right, the behavioral approach focusing on conditioning. This view basically says our behavior is learned through interacting with our environment. Big focus on observable actions and what triggers them.
Not so much the internal stuff.
Less so, yeah. More about stimulus and response.
So what are the strengths of that very external, observable focus?
A key strength is the reliance on controlled experiments. Think Pavlov's dogs, Skinner's boxes. They designed very careful experiments to see how associations and consequences shape behavior.
Very systematic.
Very. And that allowed them to get measurable, quantifiable results.
Which means?
It means the results can be repeated and tested by others. That's huge for science, right? Reliability. The basic principles of conditioning hold up across many studies. As students, you'll see this emphasis on replication is key.
Makes sense. If you can repeat it and get the same outcome, the theory gets stronger. Okay, but where does it get criticized?
One big criticism. It can seem overly simple or reductionist.
Too simple.
Yeah, some argue focusing only on stimulus response doesn't really explain complex human things.
Yeah.
Like creativity or language or even something like depression, which involves thoughts and feelings too.
So it explains simple learned reactions well, maybe, but not the really complex stuff.
That's the argument. Another limitation. A lot of the early work was based on animal studies.
Right. Rats and pigeons.
Exactly. And while that tells us a lot about basic learning, can we perfectly generalize it all to humans with our complex thoughts and language? It's debatable.
Good point. A rat pushing a lever isn't quite like a human making a life decision.
And there are also ethical issues with animal testing, which is always a concern in research.
True. Anything else?
Well, there can be inconsistent results. People and animals, too, don't always respond to conditioning in the exact same way. There's variability.
So individual differences pop up again. Okay. Now, within learning, there's also social learning theory. How does that fit in?
Right. Social learning theory, think Albert Bandura. It builds on behaviorism, but adds a crucial layer. We also learn by watching and imitating others, and it brings cognition back into the picture a bit.
Learning by observation. What's the strength there?
It's supported by strong evidence. The classic is Bandura's Bobo doll experiment.
Ah, yes, the kids watching the adult hit the doll.
That's the one. It clearly showed kids learn aggressive behavior just by watching. It was a controlled experiment, pretty reliable. You'll definitely cover that one in your courses.
A famous one. So observing others is key. What are the weaknesses of SLT?
Even though it adds observation, it's still sometimes called reductionist.
Still too simple.
Some argue it might still underplay biological factors or deeper cognitive processes. It focuses heavily on learning from the social environment, maybe not the whole picture of why we behave as we do.
Okay, so it broadens things from just direct reinforcement, but maybe still doesn't capture everything.
That's a fair summary, yeah.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground here. Psychodynamic, cognitive, biological, the different facets of learning.
We really have. And the key takeaway for you students is that each of these offers a valuable lens on human behavior. None of them is the single right answer.
Right. They all have strengths.
And limitations. As you keep studying, think about how you might apply these different approaches to understand specific things you're learning about. And be critical, weigh those strengths and weaknesses. That critical thinking is, well, it's what studying psychology is all about.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Considering all these different perspectives we've talked about, how could we maybe create a truly holistic understanding? One that genuinely integrates the best bits from the psychodynamic, the cognitive, the biological, and the learning approaches. What might that look like? And what kind of future research could help us bridge these gaps and get an even richer picture of, well, us?
That's the big question, isn't it? Something to ponder.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.